Namaskar and welcome to another edition of the Innovation Friday series. इस बार फ्राइडे में आपसे मिलने का बहुत आनंद हम सबको है. It's very great to see that lots of cities have joined in well in time early. कुछ cities ने ट्वीट करना भी already शुरू कर दिया है. Obviously मुझे शायद पूरे engagement process में का walk through ना देना पड़े. It's already great to see that cities are very active and involved in the Innovation Friday sessions. फिर से एक बार आप सबका बहुत स्वागत है आज के एडिशन में. शुरू करने से पहले मैं 2 मिनट लेना चाहूँगी. अगर कुछ शहर पहली बार हमारे साथ इस सेशन पे आज हैं, if some cities are joining us for the first time today, then you may just like to understand the layout of the user interface that has been created for you, especially for these innovation exchange sessions. आप देखेंगे कि आप मुझे एक वीडियो स्क्रीन पे आप देख रहे हैं. मेरे नीचे आप देखेंगे कि 4 हमने यूटिलिटीज़ क्रिएट करके रखी हैं. पहली जो यूटिलिटी है वो सबसे इम्पॉर्टेंट है हमारे लिए, क्योंकि इसके द्वारा हम आपके प्रश्नों को देख पाते हैं. दैट्स द क्वेश्चन फील्ड. वी वुड लाइक यू टू प्लीज सबमिट एज मेनी क्वेश्चंस एज पॉसिबल थ्रू आउट द सेशन while the speaker is presenting, as well as during the question and answer session as well, because we curate and we pick up all the questions that come through, and it gives us an opportunity to respond to some during the session and some perhaps later on through the Smart Cities webinar page. In addition to that, the next to it you will see the Twitter activity box. As you know, हमारा जो Smart Cities का handle है, उसके अलावा जो hashtag है Smart Cities Challenge, उस hashtag पे आप डाल के अपने tweet questions या comments भी भेज सकते हैं, inputs, feedback भी भेज सकते हैं. We can see that, we can curate it. वहाँ से भी हम प्रश्न उठा के हमारे speaker तक पहुँचा सकते हैं. So that's the Twitter feed. The one after that is really the poll section. It's another interactive space created specially for engagement. और आज के सेशन में इस पोल सेक्शन का बहुत अहम यूज़ होने वाला है, क्योंकि हम देखेंगे कि हमारे स्पीकर जो है उन्होंने डिज़ाइन किया है कुछ क्वेश्चंस उनके कंटेंट के थ्रू. मैं चाहूँगी कि वो शहर जो एक साथ एक ग्रुप में बैठे हैं, इफ़ यू आर सिटिंग इन अ रूम, मैनी ऑफ यू आर सिटिंग टुगेदर एंड यू माइट बी अ लिटिल फार अवे फ्रॉम द computer screen or the computer keyboard, from where you can actually put in the poll. Today, you may actually want to make sure somebody is sitting close to that as well. आज के session के अंतर्गत हम काफ़ी polls on करने वाले हैं, और उन polls के लिए सबके पास होंगे करीब 20 या 30 सेकंड उसको आंसर करने के लिए. बट बहुत important, ज़रूर watch out for that and make sure that there's somebody sitting close to the computer to press that. That's the poll section. आप देखेंगे कि पोल सेक्शन में एक प्रश्न ऑलरेडी लाइव है, वो सेक्शन हाईलाइटेड भी होगा. एक प्रश्न ऑलरेडी है, क्या स्मार्ट सिटी की फाइनेंसिंग स्ट्रैटेजीज पे आपका शहर ऑलरेडी काम कर रहा है, काम कर चुका है? हमें फीडबैक ज़रूर दीजिए. उसके अलावा जो लास्ट सेक्शन है, जो हमारा लास्ट यूटिलिटी है, वो है डाउनलोड्स. एंड यू विल फाइंड दैट 2 documents have already been uploaded over there, available for your download. One of them is the set of slides that our speaker today is going to share. Those are available for your review in case you want to download them, keep them available for reference. The other document is, of course, the profile of our speaker who's joining today. So getting quickly into that and hoping that all of you have taken a moment to respond to the poll, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today. Dr. O.P. Agarwal, इनसे आप काफ़ी लोग ऑलरेडी जो आइडियाज़ कैंप तक आए थे दिल्ली, आप मिल चुके होंगे. उनके सेशन में भी उनके सेशन को भी आपने पार्टिसिपेट किया है. एंड सो आई एम श्योर दैट ऑल ऑफ यू आर लुकिंग फॉरवर्ड टू बीइंग एबल टू एंगेज विद हिम अगेन. Dr. O.P. Agarwal is the Executive Director of the Indian School of Business at the Mohali campus, and he is a known expert, of course, in infrastructure management. We are also we've been able to invite him once again for a session to be able to join us. He was on the line with us right now, but we seem to be having a technical drop from his end for a moment. His bandwidth seems to have suddenly dropped. He's joining us today, in fact, from the US via WebEx for this particular session. It's very early in the morning for him. He's been awake for the last few hours testing with us, so I'm sure we'll have him back online in a second. While we wait for OP, I think we seem to have got him back online. I'm hoping that all of you have responded to the poll question. Moving on and quickly handing over to OP because there is a very, very interesting set of slides prepared. And like I said, poll questions, be ready for them. We'll give you a quick little bit of time to respond to them. Dr. Agarwal, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us for today's session. Clearly on a very interesting topic. We've received a lot of questions on this as well. Financing smart cities is on top of everyone's mind because that's really the crux of building out the projects that the teams are looking at. Over to you. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Parvati, and good evening to everyone who's there. Unfortunately, I can't see you, but I'm sure I know many of you already. So good evening to everyone. Let me move on straight to the presentation. I want this to come up for you to see. Okay, it's about financing smart cities. And the first thing I would like to do on this is caution everyone that very often when we talk about financing, we only think in terms of financing the capital and expenditure. So if you want to build something, you only think in terms of financing how to build it. That's really not enough. And why I'm saying that's not enough, let me just go through this slide. There are really three phases to financing or three stages to a project where we need financing. The first is the preparation phase, then the construction phase, and this is what we tend to focus on very often in terms of looking for financing. But very importantly, there's also the operations and maintenance. Now, what happens in the preparation phase? Mostly it's the phase where you have the conceptualization, you prepare the DPR, you structure the project, and there is an appraisal of that whole project. ये सारा जो preparation phase बोला जाता है, जहाँ DPR बनता है, project की structuring होती है, this is the preparation phase. The construction phase is the phase where we build the facility. वहाँ पे जो भी हम बनाना चाहते हैं वो इस stage पे बनाया जाता है और यहाँ पे पैसे काफी जरूरत पड़ते हैं. एक lump sum की is a fairly lump sum requirement of money at this stage. But something we tend to forget is the money that is needed at the O&M stage, the operations and maintenance phase. This is where you plan the services. This is where the services are actually operated, and then there is a requirement of maintenance. So if buses are to be maintained, buses are to be operated, where they will run, how they will run, that is all the service planning role. तो ये सारा काफी सालों तक चलता है, इसमें काफी पैसे की जरूरत पड़ती है और हमें ये स्टेज भूलना नहीं चाहिए. अब हर एक स्टेज के लिए पैसे जनरली कहाँ से आते हैं? Where does the money come from each stage? Preparation invariably comes out of the owner's own funds. So whoever owns that project, that owner provides the funds for the preparation stage. Luckily, the amount required is not very high. It's usually small. The construction phase usually comes out of the promoter's own funds, which is what's called equity, or you have loans, or you have government grants. These are the three major stages, phases of financing the construction. The operations and maintenance, typically this is funded out of fares or fees. So if you have a bus system or a metro system, the fares would tend to fund the operation and maintenance. Often the operation and maintenance cannot be funded out of fares and fees, so you end up with some subsidies, or you look at certain alternative sources of income for financing this phase. So these are the three phases of financing, and I would request everyone to keep in mind that it's not just about construction, it also involves the operation and maintenance phase. You have to think about that as well. Okay, let me now move on. So one common question that I have heard everyone asking, we need 10,000 crores for our smart city, maybe more than that. But government is giving us only 1,000 crores. 500 crores from the central government, 500 crores from the state government. There's only 1,000 crores. So how do we get the rest of the 9,000 crores or more? Where will it come from? This is a question most people are asking. Now, let me go through this a little more. What does that 1,000 crores stand for? Let's look at how projects have been financed or are being financed. The traditional method of financing is that the entire cost is met out of public funds. Now, typically this would happen if the project does not generate any revenues. So there is no income flowing from that project. कुछ पैसा नहीं मिल रहा उस project से. Traditionally, this is what was done. Roads were built with public money, hospitals were built with public money, everything was done with public money. A later development is what is called commercialization. Now, commercialization, public money was generally about 1/4 or 1/3 of the total cost. The rest was taken as a loan. Now, the loan needs to be repaid. And to repay the loan, you need some revenues. So projects that can earn some revenues would tend to take a loan to finance the project. The next innovation was what is called the PPP approach, where the equity or what was public funds now get split between private funds and public funds. So there, the requirement of public funds comes down even more. Now, in this situation, you not only need revenues to repay the loans, but the private sector is looking for a certain return on its investment. So it should be able to give them that return on the investment. Finally, what is called the private sector funding, again the same structure except that for public funds, you replace them with completely private funds. Here again, you need enough revenues to pay back the loans and also give a return to the private sector. Now, what does this 1,000 crores stand for? The 1,000 crores only stands for this portion, the public funds portion. So how you finance a project, how much of public funds you use on a project will determine how far you can take the 1,000 crores. If you want to use the 1,000 crores to fully fund every project, it won't take you very far. But if you use the public funds to leverage loans and to leverage funds from the private sector, it can actually take you very far. Now, the question that comes up is, can we use the private sector everywhere? Kya private sector sab jagah aayegi? The answer to that is really no. So how do we decide where to use them? Here, what I would suggest is, look at all projects along a two-dimensional matrix. Some projects will have very high public value. Others will not have such a high public value. Some projects will be profitable. Others will not be profitable. Now, in this matrix, how do we decide what works best in what situation? I would argue that if something has high public value but is not profitable, look at the public sector, because the private sector won't come into this. And it's a good case for the government to invest because it has high public value. It's not profitable, so the private sector won't come. Now, if you take the other extreme, there is low public value, but it's highly profitable. Why should the government invest in this? There is not enough public value and it's very profitable. So get the private sector to invest in this. You may have cases where they are both profitable and high public value. It's a case to think of a PPP arrangement. So this is what I would present to you as a possible framework of thinking of where to get the private sector, where to use the public sector, and where to use PPP. Let me give you a few examples. Now, public funding. What are the kinds of cases where public funding has been used extensively? In most cases, metro rail systems have used public funding, but it's public funding with a component of loans. Almost 2/3 or 3/4 comes as a loan component. Then you have roads and flyovers are generally done with public funds inside a city. Drainage systems, water supply systems, some hospitals, in particular safety services, so fire brigade, ambulance, policing, these are all safety services. These come out of public funds. Some educational institutes and also low-income housing tends to come out of public funds. Some examples of private funding, usually high or medium-income housing, some hospitals, specialty hospitals, maybe some small parking facilities, often bus services come from the private sector. A lot of the economic infrastructure, That means infrastructure which can be used for economic activities tends to come very nicely from the private sector. Entertainment facilities, so cinema halls, recreation facilities often come from the private sector, and increasingly telecom services are coming from the private sector. Some examples of PPP funding. In some cases, metro rails or light rail systems have attempted PPP funding. A number of parking projects also come under PPP arrangements. You have public transit terminals, so bus terminals, metro terminals, interstate bus terminals typically. They've come under PPP arrangements. In some cases, solid waste management has also been attempted under PPP, and several large cities have started using PPP for their airport buildings. So these are a few examples of what can be done under public funding, private funding, and PPP. It's not that it has to be only this way. There can be variations, but this is just a broad, rough model that you can think about. Now, there are a few other questions that I would encourage you to ask each time a project is thought of. These questions will help you determine whether we really need that project and how do we finance that project. So some of these questions to think of are, can we not meet the demand by reducing losses or improving efficiency? Now, most cities will want to increase their power supply systems. So if you have a certain amount of power supply that is not enough, you need to increase that supply. Now, to increase that supply, do we set up new generating plants? What do we do? Or is there a scope for reducing our losses? Now, 30% of the power is lost in transmission and distribution losses. It's much higher than international norms. So what can we do to reduce these losses? That may be a way of, not requiring the additional capacity to be put in place. Similarly, a large amount of water supply, or the water that we supply through our pipeline system, gets lost because of leakages. So perhaps improving or identifying the leakage points and plugging them may help in reducing the need for increasing our water supply. On the other side of this whole thing, is there a way by which we can reduce the demand? I mean, is there something that we can do so that people don't need so much more electricity? Suppose you have disincentives for high consumption of electricity, so that your fare structure, for example, or the tariff structure for electricity could be such that people start looking at conserving electricity instead of being reckless with electricity. It may help in reducing the need to set up additional power generation. Similarly, can we look at renewable sources which are locally available? Say rainwater harvesting, solar energy, these kind of things can help in reducing our need for increasing capacity. The reason I'm giving this is we tend to look at this is our infrastructure gap and this is what we need to build. What we should also think in terms of is this is our gap, we build so much, we save so much. And by doing that, we can reduce the total size of the investment we need to make. Another set of questions I would say, very often we tend to build high-cost facilities needlessly. Do we really need such a high-cost facility? Think about it. Does every city need a metro system? A metro system costs almost 300 to 400 crores per kilometer. Would a normal bus service, suppose we add more buses, would that not be enough? It's something to think about. Can local renewable energy grids meet some of the energy demand? Can improved parking management help create space on the road? Very often we tend to widen roads because we say that it's too narrow, it's too congested. Both sides of the road are occupied by parked vehicles. Now, it's very easy through local management methods to get the parked vehicles off the road and onto some kind of off-street parking. That creates space for the vehicles to move, and you won't have to then widen the road. So these are again certain other things to think about. Finally, is there a way the community can contribute to something? Are there certain facilities that can be built out of community contributions? This is another interesting way that has been tried out in many places. Many parks, for example, local roads, people have tried getting money raised from the community by naming the park after somebody or by naming the road after somebody. So very often the family tends to contribute towards that facility just because it's named after the person's father or mother or something like that. These are some ways that you can think of trying to raise small money for some of the facilities. So the purpose of suggesting some of these questions to ask is to test whether you really need to invest that much. Is there a way by which you can reduce the investment requirements? Okay, now with this, let me get to some of the poll questions that Parvati spoke about. The first question I would like to ask you, and you have one of the options of redevelopment. So suppose you have a 100-acre plot of land, which has a lot of residential accommodation. It has a lot of shopping centers, primarily a shopping and residential area. But you need to build many more houses. There's a lot more housing that needs to be built. And what you want to do is break down this whole thing and build high-rise accommodation so that you can get more houses and a more modern kind of a township. If you were to do something of that sort, would you use public funds for this? Would you use a PPP structure? Or would you ask the private sector, look, I'm giving you this land, come and redevelop it. This is what I want to do. What would you like to do?
आप देखेंगे कि on your screens the poll section has been highlighted. You will find that the poll that Dr. Agarwal just shared with you on his slide is also available in the poll section. Please take a few seconds. If you're in a large group together, go walk over to the computer that is connected to the LCD projector. Do give us feedback. This will help Dr. Agarwal actually as we go through the next set of slides, and it will also give a very interesting input into how some of the cities are looking at financing some of these models. So do go ahead, take a minute and please respond to this poll. 3 options have been provided. 3 वहाँ पर options, 3 options are there: public funds, adopt a PPP structure, or give it to the private sector. Which one would you choose? Go ahead and select one of them. As soon as you select your response, you will also see that the total responses that have been received so far will become visible to you. So you will see a little pie chart and you will see how your response fares compared to what the larger group may have submitted already at the point that you submitted. So go ahead, take a minute and please respond to the poll. We'll wait for a couple of seconds as we request the teams to go ahead and respond to this particular poll question. I know that Dr. Agarwal has more questions lined up for all of us to respond to in polls. But while we wait for all cities to respond, I also want to remind you that at the end of the speaking session, we will have almost about 40 minutes today dedicated to Q&A. So if there are questions that you need to ask around financing strategies, around the frameworks of leverage that Dr. Agarwal is talking about, make sure that you're sending those to us in the dashboard as well as through Twitter. We'll be receiving them. Over, back again to you, Dr. Agarwal.
Okay, अब मैं एक दूसरा सवाल पूछूंगा. You need to develop educational potential. You've decided that your city can be an education hub and you want to build some more educational facilities. Primarily, you've decided to build a new large university. You've identified land for that, and you want this university to provide high quality education in multiple disciplines. The question again is the same. Will you use public funds? Will you use PPP? Or will you ask the private sector to come and build this?
Dusra poll ka question is now available as well. The question would have changed on your screens as well. You'll see the second question that Dr. Agarwal has shared on his slide is now available. 3 options फिर से हैं: public funds, क्या आप PPP structure adopt करेंगे, or will you give it to the private sector? Again, I will request you all to make sure that you've responded. Feedback has begun to come in for the first question, and looking forward to inputs on this next question. Again, just a reminder that we also are looking now for questions to come up towards the end for discussion. I'm not sure if I reminded everyone that we have a phone line that we use. For cities that haven't used that as yet, we would love to hear from you. So you can put in a question, put in your phone number and tell us that you want to be called. Somebody from our end will actually call in and make sure your line is fine and connect you in. This will happen once we have finished the section of discussion right now. Hoping that all of you have responded to the second poll question as well, and going back to Dr. Agarwal to continue forward.
Okay, now with this, let me move to a slightly different direction. Regardless of whatever you may have done, you've identified a certain need for investment, you've looked at the private sector, you've looked at loans, there may still be gaps. There will still be gaps. In fact, the question that will now come up is, how do I bridge the gap that still remains? What are the options that I have for bridging the gap that still remains? Here, just look at it this way. You want to look at bridging the gap to meet capital expenses, and you want to look at money to bridge the gap to meet O&M expenses. Let me now show you some options for each of them. To bridge the gap for capital expenses, there are really these three options: loans, sale of assets, and tapping money from other government programs outside the Smart City program. Now, loans can come as commercial loans. They can come from multilateral bank loans like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. You get a lot of bilateral loans from JICA, from the Swedish agencies, from the Canadian agencies, from Dept, the German agencies, KfW. So these are some of them that you should look at to give you loans. Commercial loans are generally high interest, so you don't look at them for infrastructure projects, but multilateral development banks and bilateral banks would also be able to give you loans at lower rates of interest. Suppliers' credit is something that can be used for bridging small gaps. So if you have supplies coming in from some supplier, often they are willing to let you pay back a little later. Obviously, they'll charge some interest, but usually that's not a very high rate. And that is one option that has been used in many projects, the supplier's credit. Now, sale of assets. Sale of assets, I'll give you one very interesting example of something that happened in Delhi. But usually, sale of land or sale of buildings can help generate a fair amount of money to meet your gaps. Some other government programs, there are many other ongoing government programs, and it would be a good idea to integrate what is available from those programs onto your Smart City program. So things like Make in India could be used for developing your economic infrastructure. Digital India funds could be used for developing your e-governance. Housing for all can be used for developing your housing needs. Hriday, which is for heritage cities, also has funds available. There are many other programs of the government like this. You may want to think in terms of tapping them to feed into the Smart City program. Now, looking at O&M expenses, very often O&M expenses or the fees or the fares that you collect is not enough to meet the O&M cost. What can you do in those cases? Some examples, there are new taxes that you could think of levying. There are fees and fares that you could think of enhancing. There could be commercial exploitation of land and buildings, and a few others. So new taxes, what some countries have tried is the fuel tax, particularly for transportation infrastructure. Fuel tax is a very good way of raising money. Land value capture, I'll come to this a little more. But what land value capture primarily means that if you have built some facility, the value of the land around that facility goes up. And if that value goes up, the owner has benefited without having paid anything for that facility. How is it that you can tap some of that benefit that the owner has derived and use it for financing whatever facility you have built? I'll come to a little more on that. There could be other dedicated taxes that you could implement, or even have some kind of a supplement on property tax, saying that, look, your city is getting smarter, is going to be a better place to live in. So this is a smart city supplement to my property tax. Would be something that you could think of. The other could be that, fares or fees can be enhanced. If your operating costs are just not getting met, a simple way is to increase the fees. Remember, there are limitations on that. Primarily, the limitations come on the affordability side. If you have public transport systems, it may be difficult to increase the fares too much because it's generally used by the poor and they can't afford a very high fare. Now, commercial exploitation of land and buildings. You have, there is commercial space that can be rented out. Station buildings, for example, or bus terminal buildings, the buses use only the ground floor, but you have a whole lot of space above that. उसके ऊपर जो एयर राइट्स बोला जाता है उसको हम लोग कैसे वहाँ पे और बिल्डिंग्स बनाएं, और चीज़ें बनाएं, होटल्स बना सकते हैं, बहुत सारी चीज़ें बना सकते हैं, ऑफिस स्पेस बना सकते हैं, उसको रेंट करके उसका जो इनकम है, कैन दैट बी यूज फॉर मीटिंग द O&M कॉस्ट. और सिमिलरली और प्रॉपर्टीज जो है, दे कैन ऑल्सो बी रेंटेड आउट टू अर्न मोर मनी. So look at creating assets which can be rented out to pay for the O&M costs. Advertising revenue and fee for naming rights are some other methods that have been used. Advertising revenue, everyone knows. Naming rights, as I mentioned earlier, if you name a park after someone or you name a road after someone, or even for metro stations or bus stations, if you name the station after someone, very often the family is willing to pay a certain amount of money for its maintenance. Now, one of the things I mentioned was the tax on fuel. Now, just to give you an example, in the US, they charge 18 cents per gallon as a fuel tax. Now, a gallon in the US is roughly about 4 liters. So they charge 18 cents, and this helps to generate almost $40 billion every year. That's the kind of money that has been raised out of fuel tax. Now, this may happen in the US because there's very high usage of cars, but even in India, the potential for raising money from this is fairly high. The other one is the betterment levy. That's what I mentioned earlier, was when you build a facility and the value of that property goes up, the owner of that property should contribute towards the investment that you have made in increasing his property value. Now, this has been used extensively in Colombia and has been able to raise a lot of money for making investments. So something that you may want to think of. What is going to be important in this case is you cannot have a citywide uniform property tax structure. Your property tax structures then must become more area specific so that you can increase in some areas and reduce in some areas depending on the kind of investments you have made to improve the quality of that property or improve the value of that property. So that's what is called the betterment levy. It may sound complex, but not very difficult to do. So I would encourage all cities to think about this. Now, sale of assets. I don't know how many of you have heard of the new Moti Bagh colony in Delhi. This is where all the top officials of the central government stay in Delhi. This was financed by selling a 3-acre plot to the Leela Hotel. It raised 650 crores. A 3-acre plot in Delhi raised 650 crores. And that 650 crores was used to build this city. I've seen examples being given of New Moti Bagh being a smart area in several ways, but most of the top officials of the Indian government, they stay there. We all know that many 5-star hotels have been built in heritage buildings which were owned by the government, but given to the private sector to build that hotel. So this is the government's contribution. You sell off that heritage property, you get a very good hotel which comes up there. It adds to your tourism potential, but the money that you generate can be used for a whole lot of other public purposes or for building other infrastructure. So this is some example of sale of assets. Now let me get back to my third poll question. This poll question is that you need to build a lot more housing units in your city. And these housing units, you really need to increase the housing available. And you want this housing to be a mix of low-income housing, middle-income housing, and high-income housing. Now, you've identified the land, but the money that you have is not enough to pay for this. What would you do? Would you take a loan and build the entire thing as a public project? And when you sell off those housing units, you can use it to repay the loans? Or would you sell a portion of the land for building high-income housing and use the proceeds of that to pay for medium and low-income housing as a public project, so that you sell off the land for building high-income housing through the private sector? The third option would be, would you invite the private sector to build the entire set of housing and offer them the land by giving them some kind of requirement that I need so much low-income housing also? These are the three options you have. What would you like to do?
The third question should now be active on your screens as well. The question, the poll question that Dr. Agarwal just walked us through, with of course very detailed responses in the three options, but you will see on your screen that the options are provided there are: option A is use loans, option B sell a portion of the land, or option C is invite the private sector. So take a couple of minutes to be able to, a few seconds to be able to respond to that. Since the question is slightly elaborate, we will go back to the screen itself, just so that you can both read it on the screen as well as be able to respond to the poll question. So I will request us to actually shift to the poll question screen that Dr. Agarwal has shared with us. There's the question once again. As described by Dr. Agarwal, and the slightly more detailed responses if you need to read them again. Taking a few seconds of pause just so that all our teams have an opportunity to go up and respond to this third question. Very interesting examples, of course, of how the funds have been leveraged both across the world as well as in India. If you've taken a minute to respond to that poll, in case you're having a challenge, we are going to keep this particular poll live for a little while as we go through the next set of slides. Go ahead and respond to that, and we will look at collating all the results in a few minutes from now. Dr. Agarwal, back to you.
Okay, now let me start winding up. What I would suggest as the next steps for all of you would be, you're going to develop a vision for the city. I think that's the first requirement that you have to submit. But once you've developed the vision, decide on what is needed to realize the vision, and then identify the projects that you need and estimate the cost. Do this as a first exercise. Once you've identified the projects, then ask the following questions for each project. Is it viable in the private sector? That means, can it generate enough revenue to pay back loans and also give a return to the private sector? If not, is it viable as a PPP project? Now, a PPP project does not have to earn as much revenue as a private sector project, because the private sector is only a partner, and the amount that you need for returns to the private sector will not be as high. Now, is this viable as a commercial project in the public sector? That means, will it at least generate enough revenue to pay back loans? In which case, you can go for a public sector commercial project. Then the next question is, are there lower cost options available, and can they be used? Instead of building a metro, can I do with a BRT? Or can I do with simple additions to my bus fleet? Or can I do with a light rail system? These are some of the questions you want to ask. Can the demand be reduced to obviate this project? That means, is there a way in which I can reduce the demand through efficiency or through discouraging overuse and not need this project at all? Can there be efficiency gains which will help me to avoid the need for this project? And what other government programs can I tap to pay for this project? These are a list of questions that I would suggest all of you go through for every project that you have identified. It will help you to reduce the investments that you make. Thus, what am I really saying? If you have a project, does the project have revenue streams? First question. Is there a way in which revenues will be earned? If the answer is no, that means you have to take it up as a traditional public sector project. This is where all the investment has to be made through public funds. But if it's yes, then the next question is, does it have enough revenues to give a decent return for the private sector? If the answer to that is yes, then go for a private investor alone. If the answer is no, then look at it either as a PPP or look at it as a public sector commercial project. I'll end with this, but I hope I've been able to give some broad framework, and now we can go for some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. We have been receiving questions from all the various feeds, so getting them on the dashboard, also getting them through the Twitter feed, and I think Bangalore City is also very keen to be called in on the telephone line. So I'm going to begin with a couple of Twitter questions, request your response to those. We will then go into a few questions received on the dashboard and then connect on the phone line. So that our team has a few minutes to be able to do that. Twitter.
Parvati, just one sec. Should I keep the screen on, the share screen, or?
That's okay, Dr. Agarwal. We can see you, and we have controlled it from here. Not to worry. So one of the two questions from Twitter. Smart City Faridabad says, the question they ask is, what can municipalities do to gain investor confidence? Very interesting question. Also from the same team, another question coming through is financing through municipal bonds an alternative that local bodies can be focusing on? Two questions from Twitter, and then we will take a few more.
Yes, I think municipal bonds is a very good way of raising money directly by the municipality. The question is, what is the confidence that the person paying for the municipal bond or the investor in the municipal bonds, how confident is he that he will get his money back? That's the main thing that determines how much people invest on the municipal bonds. And that really links to your first question of how do you get private sector confidence? To my mind, if you start looking at, let me say 2 or 3 things. One, look at your property taxes. Are you collecting all your property taxes? I think that would give a lot of confidence to people that yes, this municipality has assets of its own, has revenues of its own that it's able to fully collect. The second thing is, what are you collecting the municipal bonds for? If you're collecting it for specific projects and the projects themselves look good, then people would be willing to invest in them. I think how you structure the project and how do you assure the investor that this project will earn revenues and you are there to support them on that, I think that will give them a lot of confidence. And for Faridabad particularly, I think the fact that you're close to Delhi, I think that's a huge advantage you have and something that you should try and take advantage of.
Thank you for those responses. One question, maybe a couple of questions coming through from the online dashboard. Can the value of land be considered as an equity contribution by the state for redevelopment or greenfield projects? That's one question. The other is a very interesting one from Hyderabad, from a consultant working with the team there. Purpose of smart city is to improve quality of life of the people, which is basically a social agenda. To what extent can the returns under smart city solutions be found to be essential? So that's slightly at the generic level, but I thought you might want to take both these questions.
As far as the first one, the answer is very definite. The value of land should be used towards your equity. So if you've given land for something, let the value of that land contribute towards your value, your contribution to the equity. You should definitely do that. Questions may come up on how you value the land, what is the value of the land. If you go by the typical land acquisition method of valuation, it may turn out to be too low. If you use some other method, there may be negotiations involved, but very definitely the value of the land should be your contribution to the equity. As far as the second one is concerned, now yes, there are a lot of social dimensions to a smart city. And I think they are very, very important dimensions. But what do these social dimensions mean in terms of financing? You have education, you have healthcare, you have recreation. These are all part of social dimensions. You have safety issues. To my mind, education, healthcare, and recreation, people are willing to pay for. If you give them quality, people are willing to pay for. The poor will not be able to pay for it. But there has to be mechanisms by which you generate revenues from the richer people so that the poorer people can get some services at low costs. Now, that's the mechanism of how you structure the entire service. Policing and safety services are something that perhaps people may not pay for, or it's difficult to charge people for that. But by and large, other social services, health, education, and recreation, people will pay for them.
We now have, I understand, the Smart City Mangalore team available on phone and have a few questions to ask that they've put through the dashboard. So I'm going to try and connect us onto that and see if the team member can join us. Hi, is this the Smart City team from Bangalore?
Yes.
Hi,
I'm
welcome.
Dharmaraj here.
Hello, Mr. Dharmaraj. Nice to have you online.
Yeah. Hello.
Your question, please.
Yeah. Now, in the Smart City proposal, we are supposed to utilize funds for Pan City and area-based development. But in Pan City, the latest instructions given to us is that we can use it only for ICT solutions. Whereas for area-based developments also, it is not clear to what extent we can utilize the funds. Because for a small city like Mangalore, now it looks as if there is surplus funds because there is restrictions of usage of funds. So we are proposing to develop a few economic growth centers as area-based developments. So can we utilize these funds on this PPP models projects?
I'm not sure if I'm competent to answer this because this is a matter of clarification on some of the government guidelines. You may want to address this to the ministry directly, but my own impression should be that if you are building economic infrastructure, it will be area-based. It won't be pan-city. So it should be possible to use these funds for area-based development. My guess is it should be possible. But I think this is a clarification that you really want to address to the ministry.
We agree, Dr. Agarwal, and also for Mr. Dharmaraj, who joined us for this question. Our next session, in fact, next week is also with Dr. Samir Sharma, who's joining us to answer several specific questions. So, something of this nature, I'm sure we'll be able to take on at that point as well. One more very interesting question that's come in from Sikkim. Mr. Naveen Rai. I'm trying to see if he is online. I can see that he's got a couple of questions, so I'm going to ask one and we're going to try and see if we can bring him online. From Namchi city, can we completely take parking in the PPP model, especially when our city has a constraint in land supply? I mean, is that a good idea to go for? Therefore, we are exploring an automated parking system which requires lesser surface area. How do we leverage funds for that?
I have seen a number of parking projects come up in the private sector. Now, the question will be, how much are you willing to charge for the parking? And how much you're willing to charge for the parking is also a function of how much on-street parking are you allowing in the rest of the city. So suppose you have multi-storied parking and you need to charge 100 rupees per car for, say, the day. But on-street parking, people are able to do that, paying either nothing or 5 rupees a day. Then this on-street, this multi-storied parking won't work. So the answer is, what you need to do is to allow, you can do it in the private sector. First question, you can do it in the private sector, but to support that or to make that effective, what you'll have to tell the private sector is, look, I'm not going to allow on-street parking anywhere near this. And my enforcement is going to be strong enough to make sure that anyone who parks on-street close to your parking facility will be fined, say, 500 rupees or some such thing. That will give confidence to anyone to come in. But I would say do give it a try. Do give it a try. And when you float an RFP and you have your, the doubt clarification session, the private participants who come or the potential bidders who come will ask you this, that how are you going to enforce no parking in other areas?
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. A couple of more questions. I'm taking one also from Twitter. Should we encourage tax-based sharing models among municipalities for growth? Should we encourage tax-based sharing model amongst municipalities for growth? That's one question. Second is coming in from the dashboard. Are there effective ways of financing huge land acquisition cost, which may be there specific to some cities? That was a question that had come up earlier in some discussions as well. So I'm going to put these two out, and we'll take a few more. We're just curating a few more questions as we line them up.
No, what was the first one again, Parvati?
Should we encourage tax-based sharing models amongst municipalities?
Now, I haven't come across any cases of this nature, but prima facie, to me, it works well. It should work well. I haven't come across any cases where, what I understand from this is that two or more municipalities would have a common tax, they would collect it commonly and then share the proceeds among them. Now, I haven't seen this in operation somewhere else, but as a concept, I see no reason why it can't be done. There'll have to be very good agreement between the municipalities, but if there is, there's no reason why it can't be done. As far as the second one,
the second question, no problem. The second question was actually, are there effective ways of when we need large amounts of land, so huge land acquisition, and when that needs to be done, what could be ways of financing that specifically in certain cities that are looking to grow?
Now, this is a tricky one. Again, I have not seen land acquisition being financed through anything other than public funds. But an option could be, if it's a viable project and you let the private sector consolidate the land, like was being done for a lot of SEZs. So you let the private sector try to consolidate the land and then tell them that, look, if you have consolidated 80% of the land or 70% of the land and you need another 30% only, that we will acquire for you from public funds. But I haven't seen large acquisitions happening from anything other than public funds. See, most World Bank projects, for example, would not pay for land acquisition. I don't know if the 1,000 crores that the Government of India is giving will also permit land acquisition costs. In most cases, they say that land acquisition costs should be met by local revenues. There may be a case for the state government to contribute towards land acquisition costs, but I don't think commercial banks or other funding will pay for that.
For our participants, from the questions that we are getting in, there are some very specific questions related to the guidelines, the mission guidelines themselves, and whether certain schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana can be integrated, etc. Just an input for our participants viewing that those specific questions, we will take up most probably in the next discussion when we actually have an opportunity to be able to interact. In this case, we're going to try and pick some of those questions that are related to the strategy of financing, specifically leveraging both public-private and public-private partnership combination of funding. In that light, I'm going to take one or two more questions here. One which is that which has come through is, while some of these financing mechanisms, such as leveraging taxes, would help the city generate additional revenue, our citizens will oppose an increase in taxes. How are we going to manage that?
Well, generally the experience around the world has been that when you levy a tax and say that this money will go towards a specific purpose, people are happier to pay. But if you levy a tax which says that it will go into the general pool and we will use it for various purposes, people are a little doubtful. So if you levy a tax called the metro tax or an electricity supply tax, something that clearly mentions what the money will go for. And if on your, website, you're able to clearly show as part of your right to information requirements, how much money has been collected and how much of it is used for various purposes, I think people are much happier paying. So I would not worry about increasing taxes provided we are clear about how we are using those taxes.
We are able to hear Dr. Agarwal, but we had lost his visual feed for a few seconds. But I'm sure we'll get him back, but we can definitely hear him. I'm sure the participants can as well. Getting private investors interested into projects can be quite difficult. We've looked at how to attract private investment, but a few more questions have come in on that particular point. So perhaps if there are any examples that you may want to share, Dr. Agarwal, attracting private investment. Apart from that, how can we structure the finances behind our project in a way that allows municipalities to maintain ownership over how the solution is run? How do we structure the finances such that the municipality continues to be able to monitor and manage that solution? So those two questions, and we're going to try and then pick up a few from Twitter.
Okay, let me answer the first one on, you see, attracting the private sector. There are two things I would like to mention. One, invest well in preparing the project. It's very important that you get a professional project preparation done. It's not something which is just putting together something, some rough estimations. It's not good enough. So you need to spend money in preparing the project well. Often, after that is done, and when I say preparing the project, I also mean getting all the necessary government clearances. See, what the private sector doesn't like to do is to interface with too many government agencies to get their clearances. I think if you've got the requisite clearances from the government, then when you go out to the private sector through an RFP and you say that this is the project I want, these are the clearances that have already been obtained, the private sector is much happier to come in, because the interface with multiple government agencies has already been taken care of. This is something you want to really think of. The second one, you'll have to repeat that for me again, Parvati.
The second one, how can we structure finances behind our project in a way that it allows municipalities to maintain ownership?
My reading of the instructions from the government is the whole idea of setting up this SPV is that the ownership rests with the municipality. So I think there should be no difficulty in the ownership resting with the municipality. That's the reason why they've decided on SPVs at every municipal level.
For our participants, unfortunately, the video that we are receiving from Dr. Agarwal's end is slightly weak, and so therefore we are not being able to bring him on that. However, you will definitely be able to hear him, I'm sure. We are now looking at a few more questions to come in through the Twitter feed. Some specific questions are here. Let me look at that. Can tax increment financing be used for urban renewal projects? Is a question that's coming in on the Twitter feed. Again, also from Smart City Faridabad, which seems very active and sending us lots of questions. Smart City MP has a thought. Can any good Indian example be seen for developing stable and financially viable smart initiatives? You shared the Motibag example, but I'm assuming that the question is to request for any more, because Indian examples are of great value. So over to you, Dr. Agarwal. We have you back on feed now.
Tax increment financing, yes. The question is, when you have tax increment financing, the increment comes from whoever levies that tax. So is this a tax that the municipality is levying, or is it a tax that the state government is levying, or is it a tax that the national government or the central government is levying? But certainly, tax increment financing is one of the things you should try and look at for increasing your pool of public funds. And this can often be used towards the land acquisition that you mentioned. The second part of the question, or the second question, was about stable and smart initiatives. Stable and smart initiatives. To me, Tirupur presents a very good example of a good water supply system which has been done as a local cooperative effort by people who are involved with the hosiery industry, and is functioning very well. So I'm not able to tell you too many examples offhand, but to my mind, these are not difficult to do. I'm also told that Agartala is attempting some kind of a solid waste management project where they're looking at almost 100% recycling of the solid waste through a private sector company. And they are very confident this will be, stable and financially sustainable. But to my mind, it's something that has to be attempted and something that is not infeasible.
That's right. And if I may add, actually, a very good example we had seen also was the new town in Kolkata, where they have actually, rebuilt an entire lake and built a very interesting facility over there, which is now economically already returning funds back into that particular model by actually leveraging, having sold a portion of it out, raised funds and then built the rest of it into a financing model. So yes, and there are also, I just wanted to highlight for our participants, there are some excellent examples of these kind of financing that are also available on the Smart Cities website, and the resources pages there and the case studies there, also they're reaching to you through the newsletters that you're getting weekly. So I'm sure those will be areas of learning as well. Dr. Agarwal, I wanted to just go back to you and see if there were any sort of summary thoughts so far from your end, and I'm going to try and collate some of the poll responses, if you like, from the ones that we've responded.
Let's take a look at that and see something may come up from there.
All right, okay. So give me a minute to just be able to do that, and I will just come back to you on that. So the first question that you had, should I go ahead and share some of that, Dr. Agarwal?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So the first question, you've decided to redevelop a low-rise area of 100 acres that has a lot of residential accommodation and shopping centers. You want to replace it with high-rise buildings. Would you use, and we had three options there, public funds, PPP, and private sector, and we have 83.3% people adopting a PPP model in terms of responses, and 16.7% adopting give it to the private sector. That's the response on that. I'm going to look at the second question that you had asked. You've decided that your city needs to develop its educational potential, and so have decided to build a large new university that offers high quality education in multiple disciplines. Would you use? And we had again three options: public funds, public-private partnership, or give it to private sector. And 50% of our participants have opted to use public funds. 37.5% have indicated a preference for adopting a PPP model. And the smaller percentage, 12.5, have looked at giving this one to the private sector. So a very clear difference between the first and the second. In the first one, largely PPP with a small section going to private sector. In the second question, largely public funds, 50% response, and 37.5 going to public-private partnership. So those are the first two polls.
Mm-hmm. And the last one?
Okay, so the last one as well, going into that now, you need to build several housing units in your city that would include a mix of low income, middle income, and high income units. While you have identified the land, your current financial resources do not allow you to pay for this. What would you do? And here we have a very interesting 55.6% inviting private sector to invest in this. 22.2% equally divided, both 22.2% are to use loans and sell a portion to raise funds. So one large, it's almost 50% between those two, but one large portion says that they would invite private sector funding, and the rest is equally divided between using loans and selling a portion.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. what I see out of this is, one, people are willing to try the private sector. I think that's a very good message. That's a very good way of leveraging the little money that you have. And to my mind, that's a very good message I'm getting. Let me make a few comments on the response to the educational institution question, where you said that a very high number looked for the university coming in the public sector. The only comment I would make is that education, again, is something which a lot of people are willing to pay for. Higher education is something that a lot of people are willing to pay for. The kind of fees that the IIMs are charging, or the kind of fees that even the IITs have now started charging, the kind of fees that ISB charges, for example, people are willing to pay that kind of a fee. If people are willing to pay that kind of a fee, do think in terms of getting the private sector also involved in meeting educational needs, and where you have economic factors because of which you want to reduce the burden, say, poor students, you could think of scholarships from the government going for them, rather than the entire investment being made by them. The other important thing on this would be to have a good educational regulatory system, which will rather be at the state level or the national level, but good regulatory systems that make sure that the quality of education is not poor. Today, a lot of new universities have started coming up in India through the private sector, and good regulation will ensure that they provide quality education. At the same time, I think scholarships from the government for the poor and needy students would help them also get in. Just a thought for participants to think about. But the results for the other two polls are very interesting. I think there is a mix, and I wouldn't say that any answer is a right answer. In all these three polls, I would not say that a particular answer is the right answer for all situations. Situations will vary from city to city. Perspectives will vary from city to city. And I quite appreciate that the answers will be fairly diverse. So that's been very interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. I'm going to do two things now. One is to just quickly share with everyone that we have 74 individual different logins, which means that many city team participating team individually have logged in. Approximately about 250 people sitting together in different rooms together right now. I will also like to share that our last poll for today is also now live. So you will see that, and you will see that highlighted as well. While we get into the next couple of questions and we take the few final questions and a summary from Dr. Agarwal, do take a few minutes to go up to your laptop and maybe use the opportunity to select an option. It really helps us to get that feedback. And while you do that, Dr. Agarwal, two more questions coming in from Twitter that I thought we could take and then sort of work towards a wrap up. One is, how do we plan for a tax increase if only half of a particular ward is being selected in an area-based plan? If only half a ward is being selected, does the tax increase work for others who are obviously not going to be impacted by it? So it's a very interesting question, considering that a revenue generation stream is necessary. And the second question is slightly more specific to get your inputs and feedback. What could potentially, is there a block cost estimate per acre for full-fledged smart retrofitting of projects? I mean, are there any benchmarks of that nature? Are there any benchmarks both from an Indian or international perspective per acre of retrofitting? How much does it cost? Any examples on that? So if you would like, I'll repeat the first question again.
No, I've got that. Okay, let me answer the first one. Yes, this is a tricky one. You don't want to have a tax increase for someone who's not benefiting from an investment. And if only half a ward is benefiting, I think what you want to do is to have segregated tax structures for both portions of the ward. And I don't think there's any reason why you should fight away from this. The ideal or the optimal situation today is you have a separate tax structure or the tax structure should become as granular as possible. So if every house can have a separate tax on a certain basis, that would be fantastic. but obviously that is not practical. But you should be able to divide wards into 2 or more portions so that you can levy the right kind of tax on each portion. That will be my answer to the first question. It may be a little complicated to begin with. You're breaking up perhaps a uniform tax structure across the city into smaller bits, but that's the way to go. The second one is about benchmarking per acre for retrofitting. Unfortunately, I have no benchmarks. What I can try and do is find out some of this, but and pass it on to you, Parvati, so you can, through some mechanism, send it to our contributors or participants. But at this point of time, no, I have no figures, and I don't want to hazard a guess. It may be way off the mark.
Yes, surely. I think, and the point is also to be able to trigger some of this thinking and reflection and questions. So, yes, Dr. Agarwal, from the data that you do find from your research on this, we'll be happy to share them. Both the newsletters go back to the teams on a periodic basis, as well as all the resources are available also on the Smart Cities website, where the data can also be added up. Can also be available, for further downloads for the teams. We are now closing in to, wrapping up our session today. Obviously, it's a very engaging topic. Clearly the crux of a lot of smart city development is how are we going to finance it, and it's really interesting to see the range of questions that have come through. I'm going to take a moment to again invite you, if you've not already done that, to go ahead and please respond to our final poll, which is live on your screens right now. And of course, if you follow up after today's session, and if you find that you still have some open questions that you'd like to reach out to Dr. Agarwal with, do go ahead and send those to us either through Twitter or through the email ID that is shared with you of the India Smart Cities Challenge team as part of the newsletters as well. So go ahead and send it across. We will try and make sure that those get responded to also. I would like to take a moment to thank Dr. Agarwal for joining us very early in the morning from his from the US and taking all the time to very patiently respond to all the questions and walk us through a framework and strategy for financing and leveraging money and the kinds of money that can actually be put into play here. So thank you very much, everybody. Please note that the next session is going to be on the 2nd of December, which is next week, Wednesday. We will have an opportunity to interact with Dr. Sameer Sharma, and all the city teams will have an opportunity to be able to interact and ask specific questions on the Smart Cities Mission Guideline and also the Smart Cities Proposal, which is now coming up for very quick finalization. So I'm sure all the teams are working towards trying to complete that. The consultants workshop last week in Delhi also seemed to have had very engaging questions. So thank you very much for keeping all the engagement going and for joining us in these sessions and continuing the engagement process. From all of us here, a big thank you to Dr. Agarwal once again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to everyone. I wish I could have seen them, but technology doesn't permit that. But I'll be happy to answer some of the other questions that come. Maybe if it can come to me on mail, I will reply to it on email. But happy to do that. Pleasure. I enjoyed myself. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session next week, much closer to the timelines of closing up all the smart city proposals, and I'm sure all of you need time for that. All the very best, and see you next week. Thank you very much.